Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Apologies for the delay in our start today.
I'm afraid it's me who has to apologize, which I do wholeheartedly. The Germans say punctuality is the politeness of the kings. So that's usually my guiding line, but I couldn't make it. I was upstairs in the meeting and it's still going on. I beg your pardon.
No problem. This is the lessons learned of modern meetings when you're trying to do hybrid events and live events and virtual events all together. So we'll just give our participants a few moments to join, and then we will get started. And I think still have a few trickling in, but our participant numbers are climbing up. So I am going to go ahead and start since we are a little bit delayed. Again, thank you for your patience this morning. This is a side event that is linked to the Arms Trade Treaty Conference of States Parties, and that meeting has run over today. So many of our panelists were physically in that meeting room and had to sneak out. But also we wanted to be respectful of those diplomats that were attending the conference to allow them a moment to join. So we appreciate everyone's patience today. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm Vice President at the Stimson Center. And I do, again, want to thank you for joining us today on a discussion on diversion dynamics and lessons learned in the context of the Arms Trade Treaty. Now, this event is part of a series of work by a consortium of partners as part of this is a very long title, Strengthening Shared Understanding on the Impact of the Arms Trade Treaty and Addressing Risks of Diversion in Arms Transfers, which is a joint research endeavor by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, Conflict Armament Research, CAR, and the Stimson Center. So some of you have come to our previous events and have read our previous work, and we're delighted to have you join us. If this is the first time that you are participating in one of our events, welcome, and we hope that you continue to participate in the future. This project really aims to enhance knowledge and facilitate dialogue among states to strengthen shared understanding on the impact of the Arms Trade Treaty in addressing the risk of diversion in arms transfers, and to identify options and avenues for more effective policies and practices under the treaty moving forward. So we're not just looking at the issues, we're actually providing practical tools and recommendations to address the risk of diversion. So many of you may be familiar with some of the reports that we've launched previously and side events just like this. I encourage you to check out our previous reports and events on the topic. You can find them on UNIDIR, CAR's, or Stimson's web pages. And we thought the occasion of the 7th Conference of States Parties would be a good opportunity to reflect on the issue of diversion and the activities of the working groups and subsidiary bodies of the ATT on diversion, including the new Diversion Information Exchange Forum. For years, we've known that the diversion of conventional arms and related ammunition, munitions, parts, and components to unauthorized end users and uses pose a significant threat to societies around the globe. The ATT even has a specific article, Article 11, which requires states parties to take measures to specifically prevent, detect, and address the diversion of conventional arms. Many other ATT articles also contain obligations and recommendations to strengthen national capacities to prevent, detect, and address diversion. So we've come together today to discuss some of the key what, where, how, who factors that facilitate the diversion of conventional arms. And our esteemed panel will share what the ATT can do to address and prevent diversion, and share some of the red flags that national authorities should keep in mind when seeking to prevent, detect, eradicate, and address diversion. I'm also very excited to share that this event will launch the 3rd issue brief by the UNIDIR, CAR, and Stimson Consortium called the Diversion Analysis Framework. So just a quick housekeeping note, each of our speakers will make some introductory remarks, and then we will have an open discussion. So as our speakers are presenting, please feel free to leave any questions that you might have in the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to incorporate them into our discussion. So let me now turn to our speakers. I'll introduce them just before they speak. So I first want to welcome Rainer Schmiedchen from the German government to provide some opening remarks. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. I should be more precise. Not so really the German government, it's the German Federal Foreign Office, but that's not so important. I feel privileged to be invited here, and I am privileged in another form because I have seen the final draft of the diversion analysis framework. I found that an impressive document, easy to use. What I liked in the DAF, as I will call it, the paper asks the right questions. It gives a lot of good answers. It is good for newcomers like me in the export control field. For instance, I've never heard before about the Otterlo incident, most interesting. The idea of DAF as a tool to structure reporting and standardize data on detected cases is excellent from my point of view. Yeah, and it is a good checklist, certainly, to systematically document diversion cases. Now, let me give you some personal remarks, like diversion and me, or diversion in Germany. As I was brought up in a country without private possession of arms, I remember the moment when serving the army for the first time, we had these little bullets in our hands. And I tell you, nearly everyone took some of them away. And it was a kind of diversion from my point of view. Of course, we gave it back the next day and so on and so forth. But there is a kind of personal involvement, a kind of profit making, a kind of fighting for the right whatsoever involved in that, and no one can predict what's really going to happen. Recently, during the last 2-3 weeks, we have, from my point of view, witnessed one of the biggest diversions ever in that one country, and it makes us sad, and it is frightening from my point of view. No one was prepared, regardless of all sophisticated measures of export control and so on and so forth. No one was prepared on that big diversion which took place, and I feel that no one really knows what to do about it. Rachel, you asked about the red flag. From my day-to-day business, my personal red flag is that considerations with regard to diversion are included in 1 out of 2 decisions I have to make day by day. So whenever we decide about cases, there is in 50% the question, can that be diverted? Can it be used for harming women, and all these questions? That is our day-to-day business. And I think DAF can be helpful in that regard. Good news, or a good tool of remedy with regard to diversion, might be, from the German point of view, the so-called post-shipment controls, or as the Canadians, I think, call it, on-site verifications. It cannot solve all the problems, but it might be a good contribution from the German point of view to prevent diversion. And to conclude with a positive outlook, we had recently a very interesting experience with regard to post-shipment controls. One country which was very reluctant to agree to that post-shipment control, which was, of course, agreed in a contract, which was the basis for the delivery. Suddenly they were ready to make a virtual post-shipment control, and believe it or not, they showed us some 21 sites, and they were prepared to read all the numbers printed on these devices. And yeah, perhaps that is the future in the pandemic. Make post-shipment controls via computer, take the camera, check the numbers, and so on and so forth. And now my last little remark is I would like to conclude with thanks to UNIDIR and to the Stimson Center for being a good project partner of the Germans. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I should again thank you for being a great project partner and really committed to issues related to the implementation of the ATT. It is really a joint effort, I think, to see the fulfillment of the treaty's promise to have cooperation between states, NGOs, research institutions, industry, all of the various stakeholders. And so we're very grateful for your continued support and partnership in really seeing these initiatives through and keeping the discussion and the dialogue alive. So thank you. Next, I want to turn the floor over to Stella Petrovic from the Republic of Serbia, who chairs the sub-working group on diversion in the ATT process. And Stella is going to speak about the sub-working group's priorities, the voluntary paper, and the elements of risk, and discuss what's next in the subgroup's work plan. So Stella, over to you.
Yes, hello to all. As the facilitator of the Vegeti sub-working group on Article 11, Diversion, in the mandate of the Republic of Serbia, I'm going to share details on the work of sub-working group that is already done, and as a recapitulation of the work before, as well regarding the upcoming work that we still need to work on. Having in mind the importance of the Article 11, Vegeti established the sub-working group to work on this matter in details. And from that time, a lot of work already done. The multi-year working plan was produced as a living document in order to shape the work of this sub-working group through methodologically three divided parts, if we can say so. Multi-year working plan focuses on prevention of diversion through the three phases of the arms transfer chain: before, during, and after the transfer. All three phases of the weapon cycle are equally important and should be seen as a part of whole supply chain, and especially having in mind that the elements different from that different phases often overlap. We need to consider them all together in general, but because of methodology and easier work on them, we are analyzing them one by one. During the meetings of CSP5, the first part of the first phase before the transfer was considered, and during this phase, multi-year working plan session was work on importing documentation. Import documentation was analyzed as one of the most important factors in order to prevent and eradicate diversion in this first phase of supply chain. During the next CSP6 and CSP7, the second part of first phase, namely assessing the risk of diversion and the role of civil society and private sector in mitigating the risk of diversion, was considered. Significant activities of the parties during this work led to constructive dialogue and to constructive proposals from the parties in order to develop our work. As much as we are trying to make general rules and recommendations, it is very important to know that it is necessary to conduct risk assessment with respect to every single case, and to analyze every expert by themselves. The importance of conducting a risk assessment is reflected by the fact that the risk of diversion is the most cited criteria for denial of the licenses everywhere in the world. Maybe next speakers will talk a little bit more because they are mostly on the field and know the data much better. According to the mentioned activities during the last period, as well according to the multi-year working plan, there was a need of production of voluntary paper outlining the elements of a process for assessing the risk of diversion. The paper was circulated for consultation remotely online during the intersessional period of CSP7, and it was submitted to CSP7 for consideration and adoption. The paper, according to the mandate given to the Getty on Article 11 identifies the key elements for a process for assessing the risk of diversion when considering an export authorization. It is designed as a living document of a voluntary basis, which may be reviewed in case of need, or in case of need, and in that case, the working group will do some review of the work. The paper outlines the most important elements and actions to be followed and implemented as during the analyzing of risk elements for the possible diversion. For the beginning, a paper make highlighting the key elements of national control systems for the diversion risk assessment, and that elements include among others appropriate legal and regulatory framework on the first place. The legal and regulatory framework is made for the regulation of international arms transfers. And also the paper highlight the importance of the sanctions for their violation. Because if we only need regulatory and don't need the sanctions, we are in a big problem. Then paper going through next proposals for considering the risks, such as clear administrative procedures, appropriate resources, even in personnel, even in possible training of that personnel, then willingness, which is very important, and other mechanism with interagency and international cooperation, because willingness of sharing is sometimes a very big problem. We all know that. Also, the paper later outlining the importance of appropriate measures for conducting outreach industry, then awareness raising events, manuals, information at online sources, etc. The second element is need of clear guidance for the application process, and the states are highly encouraged to provide these requirements. They can provide these requirements on through different kind of resources, through consultations via websites, publications, etc. Next element to be considered during the process of assessing the risk of diversion, proposed mandatory and essential documents and other assurances with recommended essential and optional details to be contained. That is maybe one of the most important parts, and now we see that we have overlapping with the first phase when we discussed only regarding the documents. Then the paper outlined importance of authentication of documents when needed, of course. Authentication is made in order to prevent fraudulent and fraudulent documents being used to facilitate the diversion. The next important phase in considering elements of this paper is verification of details provided in application, and that verification may be done through different kind of resources, from government agencies, special agencies, through international cooperation, but it can be also used through, for example, one very important mechanism which we will use in future as more as we can, I hope so, will be ATT Diversion Information Exchange Forum, that then we can use industry associations and some credible NGOs databases. Then paper highlighted importance importance of consideration of the risk indicators, and paper namely go through all risk indicators who needs to be considered in order to prevent and eradicate possible diversion. That indicators includes, among others, importing states' security requirements, then importing states' capacity to control arms transferred. Also, they are considering exporting country capacity to control that transfer. Then risk associated with the types of arms which can be considered in different way, and it can be a very long story if we start to analyze the types of weapons, and then legitimacy and liability of end user, then geographic position of importing countries, possible violations of sanctions, violations in the period before, etc. So the document I already mentioned is prepared on the voluntary basis, but may be used as a good guidance with all other very good diversion analytic documents. Some of the best we already know that are produced by Stimson and Unitier Center. I think that that papers are not finalized yet. You are on the third issue, I think, and we are expecting the fourth, as I know. So I hope that I summarize according to the subject and available time the previous work of sub-working group. And if we are talking about the work that should be done in the future, ATT sub-working group will focus on post-delivery. It is a very important issue, and I think that it is very welcomed by many states. I think that we really need to work a lot on this issue. This issue has a lot of challenges, especially when we are talking about willingness of cooperation. But if we try to standardize some measures and some documents to be mandatory in the future, I think we will have much better control and less possibility of diversion. I'm open for later for the questions and clarifications. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. I think for those who may not be as familiar with the sub-working group's work plan and agenda, I think it was a very impressive summary of the really practical steps that you are taking to advance not only conversations, but action in preventing, detecting, and addressing diversion. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sure there will be questions as we go on. I now want to introduce Himayu Shiotani from Conflict Armament Research to talk about CAR's report on red flags with regard to routes, transportation, end users, the different actors and intermediaries involved with the transfers, and ways to anticipate potential diversion. So Himayu, I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to you, and your PowerPoint is working. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Colleagues, friends, first and foremost, allow me to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting Conflict Armaments Research to this panel. It's a pleasure to be sharing this with Unitier, Stimson, Stella, Tom, but also kind remarks from Rainer. It's once again a pleasure for us to be here. At the outset as well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our donors, European Union, European Commission, and the German Federal Foreign Office for allowing us to continue our work. For those who may not be familiar, with conflict armaments research. Just very briefly, essentially, we're an independent organization that identifies and documents illicit weapons and related material in conflict zones and physically traces them up the supply chain. We do so in order to support evidence-based analysis to inform preventative and mitigation measures by member states. We do the physical documentation and identification actually in cooperation with national security forces. And oftentimes this is on the ground. Our field investigators are on the front lines documenting this together with national security forces. I've been asked today to sort of elaborate a little bit further on what we mean by red flags, or in other words, risk assessments pertaining to diversion. And I just want to mention first that from our point of view, essentially, red flags or risk indicators try to do four things. First, it tries to identify, and then second, verify parties involved in a transfer in order to build confidence that they are reliable, trustworthy, and thus will not use the items in unintended or unauthorized ways, or to provide them to unauthorized recipients. It also does two more things, however. It actually facilitates monitoring of assurances between the parties involved in the transfer. So what we mean by that is there are often promises made between the supplier and the recipient. For example, not to re-export items to third parties that are not approved by the original exporter. That's what we call assurance promises. These risk indicators also help us understand the reliability of these actors to adhere to these promises. And lastly, these risk indicators can also give you a level of confidence as to how likely the recipient or the parties involved in the transfer is likely to cooperate with you on post-delivery controls. I think, Rainer, you mentioned this as previously as post-delivery or on-site inspection in some cases. We use the term delivery cooperation to encompass a host number of activities that may be possible. Now, where do we focus on or think about when we think about risks? They can come from various sources, and Stella just spoke to it quite in detail, so I'll be very brief on that. But there are, let's say, information that may not be provided by the recipient that is seeking to import a weapon adequately. That raises some questions about whether that recipient intent is a good one. There may be items that may be also particularly high risk if they fall into the wrong hands, or if they're sent into a highly sensitive environment and they get lost. It also may stem from the capacity of the exporter, so the provider, to monitor and verify recipients and the parties involved. But it could also be that the recipient itself lacks certain type of oversight, accountability, and physical security measures that are equally important in regards to risk origination. Now, there are others like intermediaries, but also when it comes to post-delivery stages, adherence of those promises, as we call them assurances, are also very important risk factors to keep in mind. I've prepared here, let's say, very quick diagram. They present four scenarios. I'll talk about each very quickly. The first scenario really is that there was a risk assessment conducted by the exporter, but did not include let's say, no re-export clause. That ends up that the item is received by the, let's say, intended recipient, but is diverted subsequently in the country in the stockpile stages, because there was no clear assurance set up on that. Scenario two is a simple one, which is basically that there was no adequate risk assessment conducted by the supplier, and they took a falsified end user certificate as the, let's say, as the basis of their exports. And then there is an in-transfer diversion. Scenario three, of course, is one that both, let's say, a risk assessment was not conducted appropriately on stockpile management capability of the recipient. So once it reached the intended audience or recipient, there was diversion from stockpiles. These are just to demonstrate for, let's say, those interested in and kind of wondering what a diversion may look like. this diagram helps you sort of orient that in terms of scenarios. Now, Stella also talked about this quite extensively, so I'll skip the detail, and this is not really meant to, I'm not going to talk over all of them, but the basis of red flags is often based on the basis of denials of exports. And this is just a table that compiles based on our research evidence where states have denied exports. And this includes, for example, unable to verify the intended recipient. An exporter may deny an export on those bases. We've also seen in cases where physical security concerns of the recipient may lead to a red flag where an export is not facilitated. But also, as Stella noted earlier as well, if there are parties involved in a transfer, whether intermediary or the recipient, are on the sanctions list or watch list that is developed at the national level, these also trigger what we call a red flag. Now, I want to use one, let's say, just want to make sure, yeah. I want to do two spotlights very quickly, in addition to the basis of transfer denials. Based on CAR's Enhanced Investigative Unit's investigation, we find that there are certain concealment methods that, let's say, unauthorized or illicit end users may also utilize. This includes things like procurement irregularities or payment irregularities, use of fake IDs, use of real companies, but fake staff or fake standing of operation. This also includes outsourcing that is unnatural or unregular to deliver a service of, let's say, military item. Or you receive an application for an export that seems to be able to, let's say, it's actually asking for commercial use, no military use, but could easily be translated into military use. These are all concealment items that we at CAR have been able to document. That adds a layer to that red flags. Another spotlight example that I wanted to share with you is one that has been documented also with our West Africa team and the Enhanced Investigative Unit. And here we have found, and this is, just to be clear, this is an example from a commercial explosive, so it's not a military item, but we have found that in a specific case, over a certain number of years, European explosive manufacturers have been providing to an authorized recipient in a West African country to procure commercial explosives. But over the years, those items that have been exported have been documented in seizures by national authority and security forces in let's say 4 to 5 countries in a short span of a few years. So this, again, is an example of what CAR calls a choke point, as in small number of let's say authorized or unauthorized end users being a source of a large part of a diversion point. Now, I will move ahead to now talk about concretely the actual red flags. And I won't talk about all of them, Rachel, because it's quite a long list. And I'm sure we'll be able to let's say discover some of them as we move forward, but I'll highlight a few. In terms of recipient, one of the most commonly identified red flag by export control licensing officers is incomplete supporting documentation. So if end user documentation does not provide, let's say, to whom, for whom, how much, what, and other assurance factors, this may constitute a red flag to which it stimulates, let's say, an export licensing officer to investigate more. Another example that I will highlight here is institutional capacity vulnerabilities. We've seen countries, let's say exporting entities, more recently get much more vigorous into this assessment, looking into the capabilities of the recipient in terms of procedures and regulatory frameworks at the import control level. For example, do importers mark the weapon at the time of import? Do they keep adequate records? Can that records help, keep track of if any items get lost? Do they cooperate with the original supplier if those items are lost, and do they trace them? All these questions are indicators that we have found that export licensing officers have used in the past. And of course, the obvious one stated in this table as well is history of diversion. But I think it's also important to highlight some intermediary risk indicators. And this includes, for example, if the entity paying for the shipment of a military item is unconnected to the recipient or the consignee, that is a red flag. Or we've seen export control authorities utilize as a red flag. This applies similarly to businesses type unrelated to the purchase. So if let's say hypothetically, a car rental company is purchasing a large sum of or paying for a large sum of military equipment in another country, that may raise a red flag. Now, in terms of last few slides, Rachel, bear with me here because this is a big topic. There are also consignee and logistical indicators that may be applicable, and I'll just choose one here. It is sensitive or unusual routes. If a military item that has been purchased is being proposed to travel through unusual or sensitive high-risk zone, it raises a question from the exporting side to say, why choose that route? But even more problematic may be that this type of information is not always provided as part of an end-user documentation that is provided or requested by the exporter or provided by the importer. So it's something to look into. Now, oftentimes when we talk about indicators and red flags, the common denominator point that we've heard state parties discuss is, okay, that's good that we are familiar with the indicators, but how do you actually go about monitoring this? You know, we've got limited capabilities or capacity. How might we go about this? Our research indicates a few options. Number one, we found that desk research or open source investigation, even phone calls to intended recipients, can be useful starting point. If some information is missing, or you deem that it is important to investigate or verify the recipient further. If you have national watch lists or sanctions lists, it's also useful to consult those. Subsequently, it is encouraged that exporting entities then consult the intended recipient to verify certain information that is not clear in documentation. And where capacity is possible, and this was an interesting one that Rainer noted about in terms of, let's say, virtual on-site inspection, and this is new to me as well, so I found that quite interesting. There may be local visits that may be utilized through presence of embassies and let's say consular services. And of course, let me conclude by saying that this type of exercise could also be facilitated in multilateral or regional context. For example, the working group on diversion and the diversion information exchange platform, to which Tom will discuss further. So Rachel, let me just pause here and say thanks. I know there was a lot that was covered, but the key takeaway points are here projected for a few seconds before I hand over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Humayu. And I think if it was very significant, and I think the significant takeaway is that there is a lot of work that has been done by CAR and others to look at some of these issues related to red flags and prevention, and numerous examples of good practice. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here in many cases, that we have examples and ideas and ways in which governments can, as you said, sometimes it's just as easy as picking up a phone call or phone to make a call to see if the information on a piece of paper actually bears out. But there's numerous examples that you provided, and I think the work that CAR has done in this area and this report that you referenced is really significant. So I'm going to ask you, there you go. I was going to ask you to stop sharing your screen so that Alfredo can start to share his, as we turn over to Alfredo Malaret from Unidir to discuss this new exciting issue brief that was referenced at the beginning, the diversion analysis framework. So with no further ado, it's over to you, Alfredo.
Hi. First, checking one, that you can hear me, and two, that you can see the PowerPoint.
So I can hear you. The slide seems to be cut off. There, I can see it fully. There we go.
We have to display settings.
And then now we can see. There we go. There you go. Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Well, Excellencies, colleagues, fellow panelists, it is a pleasure to be speaking today. Thank you for the invitation to present the ATT Issue Brief 3, the Diversion Analysis Framework, developed between Unidir, CAR, and Stimson. My name is Alfredo Malaret. I am a researcher at Unidir's Conventional Arms Program, and I want to take this opportunity to discuss the analysis tool we are releasing today, which is now live and intended to help ongoing efforts to prevent, detect, and address the diversion of conventional arms. Next slide, please. So what is the Diversion Analysis Framework, also referred to as DAF? What are its objectives and where does it come from? I'll take those one by one. One, what is it? The DAF has been designed as an analytical tool for interested states and relevant stakeholders to enhance their ongoing efforts to combat diversion. This tool can help determine the what, where, how, and who behind diversion. What are its objectives? The goal of the framework is to unpack the problem in order to facilitate this analysis, to identify weaknesses in the various stages of the life cycle of arms and related items, and to help prioritize efforts to address the issue in different contexts. And where does it come from? We developed the DAF after analyzing a sample of over 200 diversion cases, extracted from over 120 public documents. The documents reviewed include the work of the organizations involved in this research and other reputable sources. After reviewing these sources, documented diversion cases were extracted and cataloged by points of diversion and by actors involved. A subsequent analysis of the documented diversion cases identified and categorized what we call the diversion enabling factors and the methods used at the points of diversion. The elements just mentioned constitute the foundation of the DAF, and we will explore them in detail next. Next slide, please. The elements that make up the DAF should be understood as an attempt to provide a broadly illustrative, but not exhaustive list of the what, where, how, and who behind diversion. It is a conceptual categorization, if you will, of these four interrelated elements and their interplay. Now I'll describe them in detail. One, diversion enabling factors are circumstances that create an environment that is conducive to diversion. These factors facilitate or exacerbate diversion. These factors are interwoven throughout the transfer chain and the life cycle of arms and related items, and can also accumulate to aggravate existing risks. The diversion enabling factors are what facilitates diversion. And these include aspects of the environment, such as dysfunctional systems and institutions, as well as devious and opportunistic tactics. Two, points of diversion. These refer to the stages throughout the transfer chain and the life cycle of arms and related items at which diversion can happen. These also can be understood as points of risk, where diversion happens. So this is a physical point. Three, methods used at the point of diversion. These are the means by which acts of diversion are carried out. These actions refer to specific methods of how diversion takes place. Some methods only apply to one point of diversion and are ultra-specific, whereas others can be observed throughout different points. Four, actors refer to natural legal persons that play a role in planning and or carrying out the diversion of arms and related items. The actors exercise agency in the process of diversion and represent the who behind such incidents. So these four elements represent what, where, how, and who behind diversion. Next slide, please. I want to pause here and I want to show through this diagram the interplay between the key elements of the DAF. These elements and subcategories should not be understood as mutually exclusive. And let me be clear, or put it differently, should be understood as interdependent and sometimes overlapping, because diversion incidents tend to incorporate a combination of elements in one event. As you can appreciate, the graph is intended to show the system that leads to diversion. It is the dynamic interplay between the different elements, almost like gears and oil that keep a mechanism turning, that makes diversion a complex phenomenon. And the graph underlines this complexity, even while trying to unpack the challenge to make it easier to understand. Further, some of the DAF elements have subcategories. These subcategories were observed in the analysis of documented diversion cases and are included to provide further specificity. For example, as part of the diversion enabling factors, we found deception, institutional weakness and failure, illicit trafficking, and technologies are circumstances that create an environment that can be conducive to diversion. As part of the points of diversion, We found 6 stages during the transfer chain and life cycle of arms and related items worth having as standalone categories. These are diversion from manufacturer, during transfer, from stockpiles, during active use and deployment, by non-regularization through gaps in national controls, and by unauthorized cross-border movement. These stages roughly represent the temporal life cycle. As part of the methods used at the point of diversion, some of the actions documented only apply to one point, whereas others can be seen at different points. Let's take diversion from stockpiles, for example, box 3 in the graph. We found that theft and violent capture by external actors, illicit removal by internal actors, loss through negligence in stockpile security, unauthorized transfer, sale, trade, gift, and rental from the unauthorized holder were diversion methods observed at that specific point. However, as one example, violent capture can happen not only at the stockpiling point, but pretty much throughout all transfer stages. So it is one of those recurring methods that you'll see throughout. And as part of the actors, we grouped observed players into 3 broad categories: government actors, private actors, and non-state armed groups. And all have agency over the process of diversion. Next slide, please. So opportunities to use the DAF. We consider it an analytical tool that can be used by different sets of stakeholders, and I just want to briefly highlight 3 potential uses. 1, it can be useful in preparing case studies for sharing with other states. For example, organizing the narrative for sharing information on a diversion case via the ATT Diversion Information Exchange Forum, or for providing details to a UN sanctions committees or panels. 2, it can also be useful in constructing national databases for analyzing patterns of diversion, and then leveraging those findings to design successful counter-diversion strategies. For example, systematically inputting cases into national databases will enable analysis of patterns regarding factors, points of diversion, methods used, and actors, and then informing future risk assessments. And finally, the 4 elements of the framework and the subcategories can also be useful for all interested organizations to benchmark information gathering on diversion and hence build a comparable evidence base across different contexts. Next slide, please. I want to conclude my intervention today with 3 key takeaway points. First, as with the previous 2 issue brief, this 3rd issue brief is being made available to support national efforts to fulfill treaty obligations to tackle diversion. While the 1st issue brief unpacked the legal obligations of the treaty, and the 2nd issue brief provided information on systematic and practical measures to prevent and address diversion, this 3rd issue brief provides a framework for understanding the phenomenon of diversion and how it manifests itself in particular national and regional contexts. Second, the DAF is an analytical tool designed to help interested stakeholders map the what, where, how, and who behind diversion. We invite you to please use the DAF, and where possible, share some of the results of your analysis to help the ATT community more effectively combat diversion. Third, the DAF is a living tool intended for adoption to different national and regional contexts. We created a framework that is a tool in the toolbox to fight diversion, but please adapt it to the context that is more relevant to your work. Adapting it will facilitate context-sensitive analysis. Thank you very much for your time. My contact information is on the last slide, and I look forward to engaging with you. The link to the publication is now live, and I'll copy it on the chat. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Alfredo. I think, if not evident to our participants, this analysis framework was an incredible amount of work, and I want to congratulate you and your colleagues who did a lot of the legwork to put this in a format that is both useful and adaptable for many, many contexts. And it's really, I hope, something that is used as a tool for states to identify their own practices as well as potential diversion risks. So thank you for that. And I'm sure we'll have additional questions. Finally, I want to introduce my colleague, Tom Nies from Flanders, Belgium, who chairs the Diversion Information Exchange Forum, which is the newest sort of body that the ATT has implemented to address diversion. It is a new forum, and so there are a lot of questions and a lot of misunderstandings about how it will work. So I look forward to Tom sharing with us some of the ideas for the work plan and how some of this operational work that NGOs and resources like the Diversion Analysis Framework could contribute to its efforts. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. First, let me offer a word of thanks to the organizers and also the involved organizations for the work they do for this event, and obviously for the invitation to speak as chair of the Diversion and Information Exchange Forum, which is also called the DIF. I only realized now that we are a bit in a competition here, DIF and DAF. I think I was first with DIF though. So if there is confusion, I will blame our dear colleagues. Hold on one second. Well, I did also want to commend the involved organizations, because they've always been our trusted companions in all the endeavors that we undertake as office holders in the ATT process, be it to increase transparency or now to prevent diversion of arms. So yes, as I'm here in my capacity as the DIF chair, I will make my remarks specifically from that perspective and aim to link some of the things that have been said to the intended work of the DIF. Also try to clarify what the DIF is about in terms of activity and purpose, and to suggest how the operational work of organizations like Conflict Armament Research, as well as the Diversion Analysis Framework that is launched today, could contribute to that purpose. For those who are not familiar with the DIF, in its terms of reference that are publicly available on the ATT website, you can read that this forum was established at CSP 6 as a sui generis body for informal voluntary exchanges between ATT state parties and signatory states concerning concrete cases of detected or suspected diversion, and for sharing concrete operational diversion-related information. So, as I referred to state parties and signatory states, that means that it is not like any of the working groups in the ATT process, which are open to all stakeholders, but that it is a limited body only for state officials of state parties and signatory states, that will facilitate, hopefully, the information sharing. Now, Himayu's presentation about the work of CAR and the red flags that they established through the work that they do once more showed their contribution to literally mapping diversion by using the information obtained from identifying, documenting, and tracing weapons. And in that sense, actually, CAR's work is very much in line with the purpose of the DIF. Because in the DIF, we want states that have detected or prevented concrete cases of diversion themselves to come forward with the operational information on these cases and share that information with other states. And we want that with one simple reason: enabling other states to assist in addressing those cases, and especially empowering licensing and enforcement officials in other states in their operational work to prevent similar cases from happening. And the information that we are then talking about is really operational. For example, names of actors involved in the diversion cases, risky locations, vessel names, etc., etc. Some of these elements are also just mentioned in Article 11 of the treaty. That is what the confidential DIF is about: operational information sharing. So not discussing more general policy issues. For that, we have the subgroup on diversion that is chaired by or facilitated by Stella, that includes all stakeholders, so also civil society, to allow a broad discussion on policy measures to take to prevent or address diversion. So the DIF is operational. Now, it is because organizations like CAR do their work in close cooperation with states that in all my presentations on the DIF and in my report to CSP7, I emphasize the role that these organizations can play in encouraging states to make use of the DIF or even assisting them in the presentation of diversion cases in DIF meetings. In that regard, maybe Himayo could elaborate a little bit also on possible follow-up work that CAR does with countries that are involved in the diversion cases that they have identified. Sorry, I looked over to the left since Himayo is sitting next to me here in the room. Turning now to the launch of the Joint Diversion Analysis Framework project, I will immediately say that I very much appreciate the reference to the DIF, acknowledging the role it could play in preventing diversion. As I also wrote in my chair's report to CSP7, awareness raising about the DIF is very important at this stage, and all help is welcome. Next to offering a whole set of elements to consider when assessing diversion, as DIF chair, I agree that the framework could help states to structure presentations on diversion in a way that is most comprehensive and effective for other states. In my presentations as DIF chair and in my report to CSP7, I have insisted that states make it part of their standard procedures that they share relevant information with other states through the DIF every time they suspect or detect diversion. And in that respect, guidance on which concrete elements to include in presentations or in documents that can be uploaded in the information exchange platform and how to structure those is always welcome. Of course, that guidance then would need to be in line with the types of information that states are encouraged to share and exchange that are listed in the DIF terms of reference themselves. In that sense, at first sight, the elements in the framework may be helpful to make these types of information more concrete and unpack them in a concrete case, especially combined with the concrete examples that are included in the brief. I do want to point out that it's not the purpose of the DIF to report on the information that states shared in any way. As I said earlier, the purpose is the information sharing itself as a possible operational contribution to preventing or addressing concrete cases of diversion. And in that respect, the potential briefing of the DIF chair to the Conference of States Parties or to the implementation working group that the terms of reference actually provides will always focus on major trends and not include concrete elements nor comprehensive analysis of the diversion cases that were presented. All that policy work will remain the task of the subgroup on diversion in the implementation working group. But in any case, I look forward to seeing the framework develop further and to it effectively being used for the purposes that were indicated in Alfredo's presentation. Now, as DIF chair, I will obviously happily remain available for any further input that you might need. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And I always like when our panelists ask questions of other panelists because it makes my job easier. But I do want to, just before I see we have questions in the Q&A and there are questions amongst each other that you have posed. But I do want to say that for many years, we have spoken about diversion in the ATT context. And it's an issue that I think there is great acceptance and recognition that it is an important area or aspect to address in order to have a more effective ATT and a more controlled and regulated global arms trade. And what I particularly appreciate about all of our presentations and comments today is that we have moved from this really theoretical conversation and sort of recognizing this as a topic of importance to really looking at practical tools and ways in which states can take action. And I think that is very emblematic of this project and of the work of this consortium, but also really a nod to the subworking group and the DEEF to look at sort of the practical tools, the information sharing, the providing information to further better understanding that allows states to really be action oriented with regards to diversion. So just a thank you to all of you and a plea to continue this move towards practical steps and pragmatic implementation of the ATT. I want to turn to some of the questions in the chat or in the Q&A, excuse me. The first one is for Himayu, and it's a question about the construct that you presented about whether it confirms that the recipient nation has adequate physical munition storage infrastructure. So obviously that's the theme of CSP 7 is physical security and stockpile management. How does that interplay with the work that you presented on red flags?
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to the participant for that question. My answer is more very much practical. It really depends. It depends on the degree in which the exporting state or the supplying state is conducting such a risk assessment. We've seen a variation. So that would be my practical answer, that some states do look into, let's say, unpacking what is meant by physical security stockpile management capabilities of the intended recipient. Now, we've seen a variation in that. Some states regard that as a catch-all sort of assessment, overall assessment of whether or not the recipient is able and capable to manage that certain type of item that is being proposed for transfer. We've seen some states, not many, but some states go into physical verification, for example, on-site visits, to verify that indeed, when we talk about specifically ammunition, and in particular explosive ammunition, so larger caliber ammunition, this is a very particular important point, not just from a diversion perspective, but also risk of unplanned explosions. So, you know, we know certain states more recently have started to monitor as part of risk assessment, whether or not there have been past unplanned explosions that have taken place in the country. So as to, you know, measure the degree in which the management of, let's say, explosive ammunition has been taken into account by the intended recipient. I think that's something I can speak to from a more general sense. Now, more practically, we've seen on the field in one of our operations a dual dilemma, really, because from a recipient perspective, that country in particular is in need of, let's say, ammunition and higher caliber ammunition that can be explosive in nature. However, we've seen two real cases where, on the one hand, suppliers assess that the recipient does not actually have the capacity to adequately and safely and securely manage that item and do not transfer. So that we've seen that case, but at the same time, we've seen some other states provide explosive ammunition to that country. So the question then becomes, is it that there is inadequate risk assessment, or is this a question of acceptance of risk by the supplier? It's very difficult to elaborate further than that. It becomes a point of speculation at that point. But I can share that as a sort of an example, a concrete example in which demonstrating that some states do take this into account and go a degree further to verify that. Thank you.
Thanks, Himayu. Turning, and I recognize that we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to move through these questions quickly. Alberto, there's a question for you, or sorry, Alfredo, I think is who this is actually referencing to as I'm reading it quickly. But the question is about the case, the 200 cases of diversion that you mentioned that were analyzed in preparation of the framework. And so the question is, what did you find were sort of the main takeaways from that research, the most common points of diversion or methods, the actors involved, and the enabling factors in your sample? And I recognize with 200 cases, that's a difficult question, but I do want to recognize that you and your team did an incredible amount of work in the background research for this framework in order to reflect the realities of diversion that is experienced around the world.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. And that's a brilliant question to start with. And yes, we did read the 200 cases and unpack them. So what we did was try to read the cases and remove all of our prior biases and let the cases tell us what was the dynamics behind them. And the result of that you can find in Annex 1 of the document, where we go one by one with all the elements, unpacking them into subcategories of what we've seen. So we really let the cases speak to us, as opposed to bringing our own backgrounds and our own experience into them. So the one point about quantifying it is that we left it as a framework, as opposed to actually quantifying it, because this is illustrative and we cannot claim that it's comprehensive of all the diversion cases that are documented ever. So we didn't want to bias readers by saying we've seen most of the stage 2, stage 3, stage 3. So we didn't do that. That's why we left it as a framework. That said, however, we see immense value in doing precisely that at the national and local level, at the regional level, when the diversion dynamics are way more specific. And that's the whole purpose of leaving it as a framework. So national authorities can actually grab it, use it, and input it to their realities. And I want to conclude this answer with a bit of action and to say that we can help with this. We prepare the framework and we can help national authorities that are interested in aggregating these documented cases when you see them at the national level, when you can actually use those findings to design the counter-diversion measures. Sorry, too many diversions. So thank you for that, and thank you for the question.
So I want to turn to our state participants, because I think there are a couple of questions about state practice and the role of national authorities in this issue. So in regards to Reiner's comments, there was a question about the process of post-delivery inspection and what that looks like, and whether any states have denied or refused your ability to do those post-delivery inspections, and how long you were working on this online post-delivery inspection as part of your national practice.
Thank you, Rachel. First of all, I would like to underline that we wouldn't want to give all these information as it contains companies' information and so on, as we wouldn't want to give all that over the internet here. But as a general outlook, the key is that the company who sells something finds the willingness of the one who buys something to accept the post-delivery inspection. There are some people who would say, yeah, but this is a considerable drawback for German companies, for instance, as other companies are not obliged to make these contract additions, and so the business might be easier for those companies. But from the state perspective, no, there is no real problem coming to terms with the inspections. The real problem is for the company who intends to sell something to find the buyer to agree that little clause regarding the post-shipment controls. And then we have to decide, from my point of view, state partners or state buyers or private buyers. Of course, state as a partner is easier to handle than a private buyer. And I can imagine that some businesses did not take place with private buyers due to these post-shipment controls. There's no facts and figures about it, but that's what people say when you talk to businessmen, for instance. It is not easy for businessmen. We shouldn't forget that. Thank you.
I think that's an important point about the necessity to harmonize practice, right? That it shouldn't just be German companies that are asking for those verifications, but part of a comprehensive package of providing systems and weapons that is just built in very naturally to contracts to not only help the industry or the companies involved, but also to support state efforts as well. There's another question about licensing authorization systems and whether or not the assessment practice in those includes efforts to do a diversion risk assessment. So sometimes we look at risk assessment about whether or not the weapons are used for human rights abuses or other factors that are outlined in Article 7, for example, of the ATT. But the question is, are diversion risk assessment processes or risk assessments looking at, for example, transportation routes, the different freight forwarders, the actors that are involved along the entire shipment process? I think that's probably more of a question for our state colleagues, but perhaps Himayu, you're nodding, so I'm wondering if perhaps you have some thoughts on that as well.
Rachel, I think this one is for Tom and Stella, correct?
It was for Tom and Stella, but if you have something to add, Himayu, you always have insights that are very welcome.
Very happy to hear state representatives on this occasion. Thank you.
Well, I can go first if you want, because well, actually, I can already refer to the work that Stella has done now, because the document, the paper that she is presenting, is basically also setting out a little bit of a framework of what the state would do. And yes, it's not always easy to organize your work in a licensing unit in a way that you have access to those types of information. But that does not mean that necessarily always involves a lot of capacity or resources. And in that sense, I think we looked at that a little bit in our EU context, in the user's guide that we have on the well-known common position, which is the common EU document with the common export criteria, which also includes diversion, and where this user guide gives a lot of guidance on how to apply those criteria. And in there is also reference to the sources that could be useful in that line of work. And the other point I wanted to make is that obviously also the Diversion Information Exchange Forum is also created for that purpose in a way, so that the information that a state has, because it has detected or prevented a case of diversion, that it would share that with other states, so that in their diversion risk assessment, they could use that information to make sure that if a certain actor was involved in one diversion case and that would pop up in an export, import, transit, whatever that they are dealing with, that they are aware of that red flag and can use that information also in their own assessments. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Stella, did you have anything to add about state practice?
Yes, maybe I can add regarding the second part of the question. It is licensing department do not have much of information required for good diversion risk assessment when they are taking their decisions. Example, transportation routes and actors. I think it is not common situation, because during the licensing process, all information needs to be at the table. So if you do not have any kind of, for example, this information, you cannot make decision regarding that export. So I think maybe some countries do not have too much information, but those countries maybe do not have a very good regulated arms export or something like that. But if we are talking about countries who had good regulations and good laws, I think all these informations need to be on table when deciding regarding to approve or deny export license. And maybe some countries have a problem regarding the training, well-trained personnel, because it is important. They need to use the risk indicators and to implement these inputs on the right way. Maybe if the personnel is not very trained, maybe they cannot do this part of process. Maybe that can be a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. I'm conscious of the time. I also recognize that for those of us who have been in the ATT CSP meetings today, it has already been a very, very long day, and there are other meetings that people need to get to. And so I do want to conclude this event in thanking our partners at CAR and Unidir for excellent work, but also really stellar collaboration in creating these products and bringing these events to you. And obviously the partnership that we have with our government colleagues is essential to that work. And so I do want to thank Tom and Stella and Reiner in your national capacities, but also in the work that you are doing to further the effectiveness of the ATT, and your commitment to seeing it implemented effectively is really something that we greatly appreciate. I also want to thank our participants for joining us, for your patience with our delayed start, for staying with us through what I thought was an incredibly interesting and pragmatic conversation. As always, this is not the end of the conversation on this topic. This is just one in a very long series of events and of work that we will be providing for you. And so I look forward to seeing you in this forum again. I thank you all for experimenting with this hybrid format with some people in the same room and others of us around the world. I think it was relatively successful, and certainly at the very least a really dynamic and interesting conversation. So thank you to all of you, wishing you a good rest of your day. See many of you again tomorrow at the ATT meetings or at other side events this week, and encourage you all to stay engaged.